cosmos and consciousness seem completely different. The former encompassing the vast universe, the latter emerging from tiny brains. Yet consciousness is the foundation of most religions. Some say it's the ultimate ground of being, whether an intentional God or an all-pervasive awareness. What's more, even some cosmologists, those who study the universe, all of them analytic and rational, most of them with not a theistic thought in their heads, talk quietly, profoundly about consciousness. Personally, I've long suspected something deeply special about consciousness. So is there a connection between cosmos and consciousness? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. I start with an Australian philosopher who advances the ancient idea that consciousness may be fundamental in reality, David Chalmers. Not many philosophers agree with Dave that consciousness exists apart from or beyond warm, wet brains, but everyone pays attention to Dave.
Dave, so as you look at reality, what are the mechanisms that you would take to include in a total explanation?
Yeah. I'm not megalomaniacal enough to think that I know what all the fundamental ingredients of the cosmos are, but I think, you need certain fundamental ingredients here. You need physics. That's got to come from somewhere. And physics, on the other hand, it looks like, at least as we currently understand it, that's not enough. You need consciousness. We're subjectively experiencing beings, and that's another additional fundamental fact about the world. And you're going to need to find some fundamental way to put those two aspects of reality together. So a lot of physicists like to think that physics is going to provide you a theory of everything. Physics explains chemistry, chemistry explains biology, and so on up. But even, an honest physicist has to admit that so far, this isn't making much progress on explaining consciousness. So that by the same principles that drove us to, expand our theories of physics to explain electromagnetism and so on, we need to expand our theories of physics to explain consciousness. It's just a consistent thing for a scientist to do.
So are we expanding physics to explain consciousness, or is consciousness something that is unexplainable by physics?
Well, in a way, all this depends on what you want to count as physics. I think you need to bring in further fundamentals into your theory. So far, we just had space and time and mass and charge. I think you need to bring consciousness into the picture. Now, if you like, you can call this a big, pluralistic, happy physics that includes consciousness, or you can call it physics plus, the old physics plus a new thing. I don't think it matters what we call it.
Well, it does to some people, because if you expand physics, then you have a radicalized physics, a bigger physics. That's one view. Another view say there are really two different worlds, and the world of consciousness leads us to some theistic realm, to some realm of spiritual realm, or it leads us to God.
Well, I think there's just one world, and it's all a natural world, and it has many different aspects. So physics as it currently stands explores some aspects of it, and consciousness, gets us maybe at other aspects of it. And there's nothing in that picture to lead one to suppose that there couldn't be a scientific theory of it all. Bits of physics, bits of consciousness. I don't see anything so far that forces us to postulate, gods, angels, demons, spirits. Consciousness is just another natural phenomenon, just a different one.
Where are you drawing the line between natural and not natural?
I think what makes a picture natural is ultimately generating the complex from the simple. Simple entities governed by simple laws and principles. So in physics, we have simple entities governed by simple physical laws. On the picture I advocate, you're going to have simple entities, particles, consciousness governed by very simple, systematic, encompassing laws. Now, to bring God enter the picture, suddenly you introduce this extraordinarily complex entity with extraordinary intellect and powers and benevolence, omniscience, omnipotence. Suddenly you've gone way beyond explaining the complex in terms of the simple. You've postulated ultimate complexity, if you like. Why take the scientific attitude here? Believe in what you're forced to believe in. Take Occam's razor. Don't multiply entities without necessity. I think in the case of consciousness, we're simply forced to go beyond what the physics-based view of the world gives us. It doesn't explain consciousness, a natural phenomenon that obviously exists. Therefore, we need, here, some further simple entities. Now, there's nothing like that, I think, that forces us to postulate God. There's no phenomena that can be explained with God, I think, that can't be explained without it. Now, some people think there are such phenomena. If you have the relevant kind of religious experience or miracles and so on, then fine. All I can say is I haven't yet seen conclusive evidence to believe in those things. I do have conclusive evidence to believe in consciousness.
Dave cannot fit the facts of consciousness into the forces of physics. He postulates that consciousness, alongside physics, is a primitive and irreducible part of reality. But on matters of purpose or meaning in the universe, Dave remains agnostic. And on matters of God, he's skeptical. Dave's claim for consciousness is rejected by most philosophers and biologists, who assert that consciousness is entirely the output of physical brains. But I hear that certain cosmologists, in their private speculations about the ultimate origins of the universe, harbor a curious affinity for consciousness. Could consciousness, they wonder, somehow pre-exist the universe? Cause the universe? To find out, I go to Boston to visit Alex Vilenkin, originally from Russia, now at Tufts University.
Alex, the question of consciousness often comes in when we're talking about physics. It comes in two ways. One, when we talk about quantum physics, some feel that the observer is an important part of the process and therefore causes some kind of independent existence of consciousness is necessary for physics. On the other hand, we have an approach that says if the laws of physics are fundamental in creating a universe, where do they come from? And if you push that back far enough, are you forced to think of some kind of mind related to that?
Well, I have to say that when I begin to think about consciousness, I am just as puzzled as everybody else. Quantum mechanics required the existence of observers. And people tried very hard to banish observers from quantum mechanics, and I think they have mostly succeeded. So I wouldn't say that quantum mechanics throws any much light on consciousness.
Okay.
There is some puzzle, however, which I think about quantum mechanics, which is in quantum mechanics we cannot predict the outcomes of measurements. So we cannot predict the future with certainty, we can only find probabilities. Question is, who decides which choice is made? We make a measurement, it can come out in many different ways. It's as if there is some blind will that pushes the universe in this way or that way. So that's a very strange picture, and you can even ask, maybe this will is not completely blind. Maybe consciousness has some effect on what choices we make in quantum transitions. But this problem doesn't arise if in the many worlds picture of quantum mechanics, which assumes that all outcomes actually are happening.
Either you have to have a many worlds interpretation in which the whole of reality branches into virtually an infinite amount of really existent worlds following every possible permutation and branching, or you have to postulate the involvement of some consciousness, as both of them are bizarre. So that's one category of consciousness which we have to deal with. Another one is the laws of physics, which we need to make universes. You've been remarkably successful in taking the laws of physics and showing how we can get something from nothing, but that nothing still had the laws of physics, and they're very clever, those laws of physics. So do you need some kind of a mind of some kind that sort of sits behind them?
I think there is little doubt that underneath the universe is mathematical in nature, because mathematics describes the universe with extraordinary precision. The question is, where do these laws come from? This question is, extremely difficult to answer. Einstein was very successful in his search of laws for gravity, for example. He said that he formulated the criteria, mathematical beauty of the laws. Of course, mathematical consistency as well. Even if you can find the laws in this way, it's still a bit strange, because who was selecting them based on their beauty? And we know beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. I don't have an answer. I know that it would be nice if we had just one theory which is mathematically consistent. But we know this is not the case.
Good, Alex. I'm glad you don't have an answer. At this stage, no one should have an answer. Alex is rightly cautious. But if the laws of the universe are beautiful, he ponders, why were beautiful laws the ones selected to actually exist? There seems no sensible answer. What is it about cosmos and consciousness such that each alone elicits radical ideas? Could radical ideas be key here? I consult with David Brin, a fountain of radical ideas. He's a leading science fiction writer with a doctorate in space science. Sitting down with David is like boarding a mental roller coaster. David, the traditional ways of explaining what it's all about are the reductionist, physicalist, materialist who say everything is the material world, and the theological view that would say, whether intelligent design, theistic evolution, some higher hand forming what we are. Are those my only two choices?
No, of course not. For one thing, there's always the business of context, an expanding context. For instance, within the normal religious format of God created this cosmos with purpose, so on and so on. Well, the Mormons believe that God was, our God who created this universe, was in a previous or larger context, in a previous universe, the devoted servant of another God from a previous universe, and that he, through virtue and nobility, rose up to deserve to be given the chance to be the deity in a new universe. Now, some would call that sacrilegious. I'm not exactly sure why, since we're not supposed to, in the classic context, even ask where he came from. But this is simply an example of what I'm talking about where you can always expand the context. The Big Bang, for example. Stephen Hawking insists that it's flowing out of the uncertainty principle itself. The uncertainty in time versus uncertainty of energy, simply causing a fluctuation that became the Big Bang. Well, what context was the uncertainty principle operating in? People like Lee Smolin are expanding that context many millions of times by implying daughter universes that give birth to daughter universes through slow evolution. So if you expand the context, that's one way of saying these are not the only ways of looking at things. Another way of expanding is saying, are even the words, even the emotions, even the symbols that we're using to look at these two possibilities pre-programmed? Are we perhaps living in a simulation where we're supposed to ponder this? I keep checking on that. Hello? Are we in a simulation? So far I don't get answers. Or maybe it just reboots every time I get an answer.
Seeing connections like no one else? That's David. Context for the Big Bang, even for God, each perhaps with prior histories. Energized by radical ideas, I go back after cosmos and consciousness. If each alone requires radical solutions, could probing them both together reveal hidden links? For this, I consult the tough-minded British philosopher who calls consciousness a mystery, Colin McGinn. Colin commences with consciousness and then reaches out to the cosmos and beyond.
Well, the original challenge is that consciousness appears to differ rather radically from the material world, as we normally experience it anyway, and because it's non-spatial. So it seems not to have any dimensions, it doesn't break down into spatial parts, it doesn't even seem to have location in any clear sense. The only sense in which it has location is it's roughly where you are. So given that consciousness is a non-spatial entity, it appears that it couldn't arise from spatial entities. So the speculation then naturally suggests itself that maybe there are aspects of the cosmos which mirror the non-spatiality of consciousness. So maybe there are aspects of what we call the material world which don't have the extendedness of the material world as it's normally understood anyway. So if we went back even to the Big Bang, we might wonder, well, what was the universe like before the Big Bang? Well, according to the cosmologists, at least many of them, the Big Bang created not just matter, but also space.
And time.
And time. So perhaps prior to the Big Bang, we have a problem with that if it created time, of course, but whatever caused the Big Bang was a non-spatial world. So that non-spatial world which preceded the Big Bang may have persisted into the post-Big Bang world, but existed as it were, in another dimension. So there may be these hidden non-spatial aspects of spatial reality. And normally they're not observable, they don't make any difference to anything. But when brains came along, somehow they tap into this non-spatial aspect of spatial reality, and they produced a non-spatial thing called consciousness. So consciousness might not be as recent a development as we normally think. Perhaps consciousness is actually taking as input something which has been there for all eternity, or at least not all eternity, but back to the time of the Big Bang. Perhaps for all eternity, because if there were preceding states of the Big Bang, that may go on, or for all eternity backwards. It's very radical. Is it radical enough? It's an interesting question, because the non-spatiality of consciousness may be a more radical non-spatiality than even this radical solution allows us.
Now, the critique would be, of course, that you have the mystery of consciousness and you have a mystery in the cosmos, and you try to explain one mystery with another mystery and think you have a solution when really you have just two mysteries.
Well, sometimes it's illuminating to connect two mysteries. I mean, if you could connect the mystery of consciousness with the mystery of matter in general, that would actually be progress, because now you would have certainly made a connection. So, for example, we don't see it as completely isolated. The consciousness is a mysterious thing and nothing else is. If matter was created at the time of the Big Bang and the raw materials of consciousness pre-existed the Big Bang, then this might be the cause of matter. So whatever that thing was, let's call it X, which produced consciousness, that X caused matter, as we see it now, extended substance, which caused consciousness as we experience it now. But the thing we experience now may have its origins in something which is even more fundamental than matter.
Colin speculates that consciousness may predate matter, that consciousness in some weird and wild form constituted whatever was before the Big Bang. That's radical, all right. But to explain consciousness, is Colin's theory radical enough? Going radical enough is no obstacle for the director of the Beyond Center at Arizona State University, Paul Davies. Paul marvels at the cosmos, catalogs all kinds of explanations, and finds them all wanting. What does Paul propose? Hint, he takes consciousness very seriously.
I don't think there's any doubt when we look at the universe, it seems a package of marvels. It's ingenious, it's ordered, it's mathematical, and it's felicitous in the sense that it permits the existence of life and beings like ourselves who can reflect on it. Wow, it looks like a fix, it looks like it's been designed. And the question is, has it been designed? And if not, well, how can we explain this appearance of design? Now, I suppose most of my scientific colleagues feel uncomfortable with these sorts of questions, they would say, if pressed, that there is no reason for why the world is the way it is. And yes, sure, it works well and it looks designed, and aren't we lucky to be here, but there's ultimately no reason to it. And I've always thought that it's extraordinary to try to ground the rationality and logical nature of scientific inquiry on ultimate absurdity. That the whole thing is just floating for no reason, and yet it mimics the appearance of rationality and order and design so well. So I don't think that's very satisfactory. So then there's another group of colleagues who think more deeply about this, and they say, well, if we come to some final theory, complete unification of physics, we'll see that actually this is the only way it can be, and that it's just a stroke of luck. It permits the existence of beings like ourselves. Now, they don't have that theory yet. This is promissory triumphalism. So I think it's demonstrably false that there can only be one way that the universe can exist. So then there's another group of people who say, well, maybe all possible universes exist. Maybe that what we've been calling the universe is only a tiny component in a much vaster system that they call the multiverse. And it's important that between one universe and another, the laws can change. In other words, the laws you find in the textbooks in physics libraries are just effective laws. They're just local bylaws, if you like. They're not universal, absolute laws, and they can vary from one to the other. And if they vary randomly, well, then it's no surprise that here and there you'll find a universe where things come out just right for life. In other words, we will be winners in a gigantic cosmic lottery, but there will be no ultimate significance to the fact that this universe was fit for life. And the problem with that idea is that you have to accept the existence of these other universes on faith, and it leads to some sort of absurdities, because if there's an infinite number of universes and an infinite number of variations on a theme, and indeed an infinite number of versions of this conversation. So that seems like overkill. So then we move on to the traditional argument that if the universe looks as if it's been designed, well, maybe it has been designed. Maybe there's a great cosmic designer. It doesn't have to be a cosmic magician, a super being who exists within time prior to the Big Bang, waves a magic wand and makes the Big Bang go bang. That's a sort of Sunday school version. It could be something more subtle. God as designer in the sense of being the rational ground in which the laws of physics or the laws of nature are ultimately rooted. So this could be a more abstract notion of a designer being. But one is bound to ask, well, where did this being come from? Now, in order to make this idea work, you would have to develop an argument that this designer being necessarily exists and necessarily has the property that that being has. Are you any better off? Haven't you just sort of pushed the problem off into an abstract domain, but you've not really solved it? So that makes me feel uncomfortable too. And the final version, which is what I'm inclined to by temperament, is that somehow the universe has engineered its own self-awareness, that the fine-tuning of the parameters which is necessary for life in the universe has done it itself. Problem is, it does seem to require a backwards causation. In other words, that the existence of beings like ourselves now, observers who can look at the universe and make sense of it, has somehow got to have selected the nature of the laws right back at the Big Bang that have given rise to a universe that can produce carbon and all the other things necessary for life. How can that be? How can we reach back in time in that manner? Well, at first sight it seems absurd, but when you look more carefully, physics actually has a natural mechanism to permit that to happen, and it comes out of quantum physics. What I'm suggesting then is that the laws of physics, mathematics, observers who can understand it all are all somehow mutually explanatory and co-emergent, that they all come out of the wellspring of existence and support each other in some self-consistent way. That sounds kind of ridiculous, doesn't it? But then they're all ridiculous. All of these things, all of these points of view, ultimately, when you look at them, have a sort of ridiculous feel about them.
I agree with Paul. Any explanation for the cosmos, every explanation for the cosmos, seems ridiculous. Nothing makes sense as an explanation, but there must be an explanation. No explanation, the cosmos is a brute fact, is also an explanation. So what's most fundamental? I have only 3 possibilities. 1. The laws of nature. physical rules and forces which generate multiple universes in which everything happens, including us. What's consciousness here? Effectively, nothing. An accident of evolution. 2. A creator God, a non-physical being who exists necessarily with no explanation. As for consciousness, God created it. 3. Pure consciousness is the ground of reality. Perhaps consciousness constitutes pre-Big Bang, non-space-time existence. Perhaps it drives a self-generating universe. Perhaps it undergirds some spiritual realm. Laws, God, consciousness. These are my categories. But to choose among them, I shrink back and dare not, though I yearn to get closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.